St. Mercy Hospital has sat on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town for 20 years, decaying as the land slowly reclaims it. Locals tell stories of screams in the night and flickering lights in a building that hasn't had electricity in decades. Investigative journalist Daniel Carter ignored these as simple urban legends. He entered the hospital with a camera, flashlight, and audio recorder to document the physical reality of the building, not to chase ghosts. This diagram plots Carter's route. He emerged with recorded evidence, but investigators discovered a physical impossibility. Documented sections of the building dissolve into blank space. Authorities confirmed the specific locations he described, room 307 and the basement, did not exist in the blueprints. They never had. To find out how a building can seemingly delete its own floor plan, we have to follow Daniel's path and look at the physical evidence that shouldn't exist. Daniel's investigation began on the ground floor, where he found medical records scattered across the floor. Most were illegible, rotted by moisture and decades of neglect. But he found one file that remained perfectly intact. It was missing a name, but it listed a specific location, room 307, and a warning scribbled in bright red ink that looked far newer than the surrounding paper. Do not let him wake up. Daniel headed toward the third floor. As he climbed, the temperature dropped until his breath was visible in his flashlight beam. He found room 307 at the end of a long hallway. Inside sat a hospital bed with leather restraints and walls covered in hundreds of symbols scratched deep into the paint. Beneath the bed, he found a leather-bound journal. This room, with its fresh ink and preserved documents, represented a localized break in the decay, the first physical evidence of a history that the hospital records claimed didn't exist. The journal belonged to Dr. William Graves, a psychiatrist at St. Mercy. He documented the admission of a patient who had survived a high-speed car crash without a single physical injury, though his presence seemed to trigger immediate psychological distress in those around him. Graves' notes describe a phenomenon that spread like a biological infection. As staff moved closer to the patient, they began hearing voices and seeing shadowy figures. This psychological spread soon became a physical one. A night shift nurse and a security guard assigned to monitor the patient simply vanished. Neither was ever found. Graves eventually locked the patient in room 307 as a form of quarantine. His final entry was a warning. The voices were getting stronger, the shadows were moving on their own, and the basement door must remain sealed. The journal suggests the hospital was struggling to contain an influence that was spreading from a single room to the rest of the staff, warping their perception and eventually their physical presence. While reading the journal, Daniel heard a heavy metallic bang coming from the floors below. He found a hidden basement entrance behind a maintenance corridor, its steel door covered in painted warnings, and its lock already broken. He descended into the basement, where he heard whispers speaking his name. His flashlight beam caught fresh footprints in the thick dust, leading him toward a massive steel containment room. Inside the chamber, hundreds of photographs were pinned to the walls. They were Polaroids and ID badges belonging to the hospital's former staff, the doctors, nurses, and guards who had worked there 20 years ago. Each photo had a thick red X drawn over the face. This wasn't a random collection. It was a systematic record of everyone who had vanished during the hospital's final years. At the center of the wall hung a photo of Dr. Graves, standing next to a man whose face had been completely blacked out. Written beneath it were the words, "He never left." The presence of this underground shrine suggests the disappearances were part of a deliberate, organized process managed by something still living within the building. Daniel heard heavy footsteps behind him. A tall, faceless figure stood at the end of the chamber, and the temperature in the room dropped instantly. Daniel ran. The footsteps followed him up the stairs, matching his pace. As he fled, the hospital itself seemed to react. Doors slammed shut, lights flashed in rooms with no power, and the whispers grew into a deafening scream that echoed through the hallways. The building shook violently as Daniel reached the ground floor. He burst through the front doors and collapsed outside, leaving the camera and the journal behind in his panic. Daniel had escaped, but by taking his findings toward the exit, he had attempted to move the hospital's secrets into the outside world, an action that preceded the total erasure of the evidence he discovered. When investigators arrived at St. Mercy weeks later, the physical reality Daniel described had been rewritten. There was no journal, no photo shrine, and no basement chamber. When they checked the state archives, the very records of Room 307 and Dr. William Graves had vanished into black voids, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. St. Mercy Hospital acts as an architecture of erasure. It doesn't just claim the lives of those inside, it removes their entire history from the world, scrubbing the blueprints and the archives until the physical space they occupied is gone. But the process is imperfect. Modern visitors still report hearing whispers in the empty hallways and seeing a dark silhouette watching from a third-floor window, a room that, according to every official record, does not exist.